In this lecture video, we're going to be looking at the concept of power knowledge in Michel Foucault. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the second lecture within the book called Power Knowledge, which is a collection mainly of interviews, but some lectures as well. So in this, we're really only scratching the surface, kind of getting an outline of one, his theory of power, its relation to knowledge, but two, his methodology and how that methodology is meant to criticize traditional forms of theorizing power in political philosophy, and then, of course, his alternative approach. So, I want to begin with the question, what is power? Because this is a typical question we should ask in political philosophy. It's a question that has been asked. But you can notice there's already certain things presupposed in that question. What is power? Mainly metaphysical presuppositions, right? That power is some kind of a defined thing, maybe a thing to be possessed. It's located somewhere, perhaps in someone. Foucault asks a different question. Not what is power, but how is power? It's different. It's not exactly a metaphysical question of the nature of power in some ways to its, substance, we could say. As he says, I have tried, that is, to relate its mechanism, the mechanism of power, to 2 points of reference, 2 limits. On the one hand, to the rules of right that provide a formal delimitation of power. On the other, to the effects of truth that this power produces and transmits, and which in their turn reproduce this power. Hence, we have a triangle: power, right, truth. So what Foucault is saying is, firstly, he's been trying to show this idea of the rules of right? Justified or appropriate, or when power ought to be delimited, right? Those kinds of the scope and justifications, and a lot of times, morally speaking, of power. But secondly, then, and notice he says the effects of power, how we actually see power operating, how power operates, how it produces truth, how truth then reinforces power. And here we shouldn't think of truth as something transcendent, but truth as, again, something social, something that regulates and justifies, institutional roles, the kind of responsibilities and powers that are imbued to people in certain positions. So the traditional question of political philosophy, Foucault says, is how is philosophy then able to fix limits to the rights of power? Because again, it asks the question, what is power? And it wants to know then, how can we then say when a certain amount of the exercise of power is justified and when it is not? And most notably, of course, right, this goes back to the idea of the sovereign and needing to put checks and balances on the sovereign. But Foucault asks a different question. What rules of right are implemented by the relations of power in the production of discourses of truth? So he's asking instead, okay, let's not theorize transcendently, timelessly, the delimitation of power and rights of power. Let's ask, okay, in a specific society then, what are the kind of rules of right that regulate power? How does that regulation of power justify the figures then that are said to possess power? But what kinds of, maybe if we substitute the word truth for like stories or knowledge as well. He uses knowledge, but that might be difficult to understand what he means by that. Beliefs, maybe we could say, right? What kind of beliefs people have that regulate and reinforce then certain structures of power, certain relations between persons, certain institutions. That's what he wants to know, right? His method is known as genealogy. It's a very, according to Foucault, a very kind of like gray approach, and that it's not meant to be value laden, right? Whereas the question of how is philosophy able to fix the limits to the rights of power? That very much is value-laden insofar as it's saying, well, certain excesses of power are morally bad, right? So there needs to be kind of moral justification. But Foucault's not trying to make this moral argument. He's just analyzing as if data, right? As if data. What are the relations? What are the effects of power? How does it work to produce certain beliefs, certain knowledges, certain myths, certain discourses that then reinforce the structures of power? So again, the traditional hypothesis then, from the traditional question of political philosophy, it's going to ask, what gives law its force, right? What makes possible the actual outcomes of law? Well, traditional political philosophy is going to say, well, the sovereign, the king, maybe not the king if we're in a liberal democracy. We would say, well, perhaps the Constitution, but the Constitution is sovereign. We would also ask then, in traditional, political fashion, why should there be limits on the power of the law? Why can't the law just be, autocratic? Why can't the law just be absolute? Well, because the king is the source of power. The king is a human being just like anybody else, and therefore can err, can rule according to emotion, can abuse power because the king is not God, right? All these kinds of traditional suppositions in political philosophy, which produce, discourses on legitimacy, produce discourses on, that result in the idea of, the general will and certain conceptions of right. Foucault instead is going to argue, no, we shouldn't focus on the sovereign. In a way, the sovereign already presupposes certain effects of power, a certain institution, practices of power, or certain practices that are made possible by power. Instead, Foucault is going to offer a twofold thesis. First, right is the instrument of the fact of domination. So right actually comes after a certain kind of domination made possible by power. Right is itself a kind of justification, a kind of normative, I'll just say normative justification and regulation of certain practices of power. Secondly, right transmits and puts in motion relations that are not relations of sovereignty but of domination. So the focus then, Foucault wants to say, is it's not on the sovereign and it's not really on right, because all these things come after power. We want to know power as domination, as a way of ingraining people into certain modes of habit, certain actions. As he says, moreover, in speaking of domination, I do not have in mind that solid and global kind of domination that one person exercises over others or one group over another, right? So when he's talking about domination in relation to power, he's not speaking of, the way that Rousseau talks about authority and the ability of one to dominate someone else. He's not speaking of it that way. He's speaking of domination as a kind of, maybe we could think of as habit, some kind of an internalization ingrained in practices and institutions. So he says, we're not speaking of that, but of the manifold forms of domination that can be exercised within society. It's kind of diffused throughout society. It's not the uniform edifice of sovereignty, but the multiple forms of subjugation that have a place and function within the social organism. Now, it's difficult to fully understand what exactly he's saying because, this is a cursory introduction, a cursory overview of Foucault's theory of power. If you really want to know what exactly he's getting at and why he's saying this, you'd have to look at his other works like The History of Madness, Discipline and Punish, The History of Sexuality, and so on. But we'll just try to focus on just the outline. So what Foucault is saying is that he's trying to articulate an analytics of power, not a theory, but an analytics, looking at the effects of power. And this kind of approach enables him to say we shouldn't think of power, right, as some kind of a substance, that's like possessed and exercised over others, but as apparatuses, and specifically as power knowledge apparatuses. That power always implies knowledge, and knowledge always implies power. They reinforce one another. He says there can be no possible exercise of power without a certain economy of discourses of truth, kind of certain justifications, myths, beliefs that reinforce then the practices and the institutions, which then make possible the belief in those discourses and the need to proliferate those discourses, which, he says, operates through and on the basis of this association. What that means is that we shouldn't think of power then as something destructive. Think of the way that traditional political philosophers talk about sovereignty, right? And the right of the sovereign, and how it needs to be mitigated with checks and balances, because in that sense, then power is destructive. It interferes with people and their possibilities, right? It can coerce and things like that. Or think about, of course, the anarchist, right? Like, power is quintessentially the state monopoly on violence. We need to get rid of power to that way, we need to suffocate, eliminate power. What Foucault is trying to say is, again, that's all kind of like a value-laden judgments of power. His methodology is value neutral. It's genealogical. And he's trying to say we have to think of power as being constructive. That power is what makes possible society. Power is what makes possible relations. It's what makes possible roles. It's what makes possible obligations and institutions. Now, that doesn't mean then there wouldn't be kinds of power that we don't want or we should try to mitigate. But if we already think about power presupposing certain moral judgments of it, we're going to miss, right? We're going to end up obfuscating the full exercise and nature of power. So I want to just think of a couple ways real quick how it is that we can see, as he says, a certain economy of discourses of truth, which then operates through and on the basis of this association of power. Think about in philosophy. In this case, it would be, we can think of logic. And Foucault is going to say, well, even in logic, right, there's a certain way in which someone is a logician and they verify the truth or the validity of an argument, right? So there's a certain kind of discourse that's produced, and who's able to verify whether the discourse is valid or not? It's going to be the logician, the one who is deemed the official determinant of the validity of discourses as the production of a certain kind of truth. And then the fact that they are deemed a logician is the kind of relation or the game of philosophy of logic that then makes possible, of course, certain kinds of agencies, like being a logician. Think about in football. And in football, I'm thinking of like the rules of football, right? You have certain rules of the game. Well, how are those regulated? By a whole kind of economy of officials and then representatives in the NFL that determine, what is legitimate plays in the game, what are illegitimate, what are the kind of possible areas of discretion, who's able to verify in the play whether an infraction was committed or not. It's going to be the referee. Well, who says the referee is possible? It's not ultimately like the commissioner, because the commissioner is also appointed by a whole kind of system, a whole kind of structure. Think about in law. In the case of law, you have a whole kind of system of rules wherein you have judges that interpret the law. Lawyers then kind of try to analyze the law and develop certain arguments that are permissible, but there's a whole kind of system of rules that say when then a lawyer is able to do things, when they're not able to do things. There's certain openings in which judges can interpret things, but who determines, ultimately when a judge is able to make a certain kind of interpretation or a certain kind of ruling? It's not any one ultimately sovereign judge. It's a kind of game, right, a system of rules that produces discourse, that produces certain kinds of truth in legal reasoning, in legal propositions, in legal judgments, legal interpretations. which is made possible by the system of law as a kind of as a kind of game, a system of rules, in the same way that football is a game as a system of rules, that logic is a game as a system of rules. And then the same thing in science, Foucault is going to say, right? You have certain hypotheses. At one point in time, there's a kind of a normalized way in which one's supposed to do science. Over time, people kind of challenge that and they push forward. Some people say no, but there's no authority. There's no sovereign within science. Again, it's a kind of system of rules that develops over time. It evolves. And within that system, it imbues certain people, certain scientists, researchers with certain kinds of powers or abilities, we should say maybe abilities, to conduct certain kinds of researches. It produces certain kinds of knowledge. Is that knowledge initially recognized by the system of science? Many times no, right? It takes certain kinds of then further developments in the whole structure of science. It's a discipline. Foucault writes about this and on the origin of things, or I'm blanking on the name of the book now, but the order of things. He writes about that in that book. So these are just four ways in which maybe we can see when he talks about this economy of discourses on truth, in relation to power. Okay, so let's get to the real meat of what he's trying to say. He makes 5 methodological points. The first methodological point: power should be sought in its power should not be sought in its legitimate forms, but at its extremities, in what is hidden or obfuscated. It should not be sought in its legitimate forms because what is legitimate already presupposes then certain structures and relations of power. So he says, in the very first place, it seemed important to accept that the analysis in question should not concern itself with the regulated and legitimate forms of power in their central locations, with the general mechanisms through which they operate, and the continual effects of these. On the contrary, it should be concerned with power at its extremities, in its ultimate destinations, not its points of origin, with those points where it becomes capillary, that is, in its more regional and local forms and institutions. Its paramount concern, in fact, should be with the point where power surmounts the rules of right, which organize and delimit it, and extends itself beyond them, invests itself in institutions, becomes embodied in techniques, and equips itself with instruments, and eventually even violent means of material intervention. To give an example, rather than try to discover where and how the right of punishment is founded on sovereignty, which philosophy traditionally does, so you would question, what makes possible, some kind of transcendent, timeless justification for the exercise of power. Instead, we want to try to discover how it is presented in the theory of monarchical right or in that of democratic right. Right? Instead of doing that, he says, I've tried to see in what ways punishment and the power of punishment are effectively embodied in a certain number of local, regional, material institutions, which are concerned with torture or imprisonment. So he looks at the prison system. And to place these in the climate, at once institutional and physical, regulated and violent, of the effective apparatuses of punishment. In other words, one should try to locate power at the extreme points of its exercise where it is always less legal in character. So rather than asking what makes possible punishment, is there a legitimate form of punishment, right? He wants to say, no, what makes possible the actual material specific exercise of punishment in prisons? What makes possible the exercise of punishment in the home, right? Maybe spanking a child or something like that. Or what makes possible punishment in the school it used to be, things like that, right? So we're looking at the local institutions, not some mystical source of the power of punishment. Second methodological point: power should not be located in terms of an origination, but in its real and effective practices. So he says, A second methodological precaution urged that the analysis should not concern itself with power at the level of conscious intention or decision, that it should not attempt to consider power from its internal point of view, and that it should refrain from posing the labyrinth and unanswerable question: who then has power, and what has he in mind? What is the aim of someone who possesses power? Instead, it is a case of studying power at the point where its intention, if it has one, is completely invested in its real and effective practices. What is needed is a study of power in its external visage, at the point where it is in direct and immediate relationship with that which we can provisionally call its object, its target, its field of application, there, that is to say, where it installs itself and produces its real effects. So we want to study, for example, in the case of the school, right? What makes possible the relation between a teacher and the students, and the way in which a teacher can call the attention of the students. Something simple like that, something real, material that occurs in a field. Let us not therefore ask why certain people want to dominate, what they seek, what is their overall strategy, these kinds of timeless questions. Let us ask instead how things work at the level of ongoing subjugation, at the level of those continuous and uninterrupted processes which subject our bodies, govern our gestures, dictate our behaviors. In other words, rather than ask ourselves how the sovereign appears to us in his lofty isolation, we should try to discover how it is that subjects are gradually, progressively, really and materially constituted through a multiplicity of organisms, forces, energies, materials, desires, thoughts, etc. So, whereas in Hobbes's Leviathan, right, what makes it such that subjects obey the law? It's going to be the sovereign, and the threat of violence of the sovereign, could ultimately use among any one person. But what Foucault was saying is, no, that's not really how power is exercised. You need people who kind of recognize and see themselves as subjects, as people to obey the law, as people to obey the sovereign, such that they don't need to be punished. They just need to internalize how they ought to act, not be thinking fearful of being punished, but this is the normal way to behave, right? Think of stopping at a red light, even when no one is around. There's a red light, no other car around, and yet people stop and wait for it to turn green. The third methodological point: power should not be thought of as something one possesses, but rather as something which circulates and is employed or exercised through a net-like organization and in the relations between persons. So he says, the third methodological point relates to the fact that power is not to be taken to be a phenomenon of one individual's consolidated and homogeneous domination over others, or that of one group or class over others. What, by contrast, should always be kept in mind is that power, if we do not take too distant a view of it, is not that which makes the difference between those who exclusively possess and retain it and those who do not have it and submit to it. Power must be analyzed as something which circulates, or rather as something which only functions in the form of a chain. It is never localized here or there, never in anybody's hands, never appropriated as a commodity or piece of wealth, right? Like, what gives the President of the United States their power? A system of rules. It's not that they just have this power that they're able to wield over others, right? Even the president can be put in check. Not because somebody else then has power over them, but the position which they occupy has a certain kind of ability conferred to it by a system of rules. Power is employed and exercised through a net-like organization. And not only do individuals circulate between its threads, they are always in the position of simultaneously undergoing and exercising this power. They are not only its inert or consenting target, they are always also the elements of its articulation. That means even those who are subjected to power also reciprocate power in other ways. In the same way that, think about how A teacher has a certain kind of power over students, and yet students have a certain kind of power over the teacher insofar as they kind of surveil, right, the teacher. When the teacher doesn't do something appropriate, the student can report the teacher. There's a way in which then there's a reciprocation. In other words, individuals are the vehicles of power, not its points of application. The individual is not to be conceived as a sort of elementary nucleus, a primitive atom, a multiple and inert material on which power comes to fasten, or against which it happens to strike, and in so doing subdues or crushes individuals. In fact, it is already one of the prime effects of power that certain bodies, certain gestures, certain discourses, certain desires come to be identified and constituted as individuals. The individual, that is not the vis-a-vis of power. It is, I believe, one of its prime effects. The individual is an effect of power, and at the same time, or precisely to the extent to which it is that effect, it is the element of its articulation, that certain populations don't exist prior to power, but they exist as a result of power. It is that effect which is the element of its articulation. The individual which power has constituted is at the same time its vehicle. I mean, I think one example of this is, think about race, or in particular, maybe like ethnicity. Before the 1980s, there was no separate, like Hispanic or Latino category that someone that we would say now is Latino or Hispanic would check on like a census or whatever. In fact, they were deemed legally white, and in many cases, Hispanics, Latinos that lived in Florida and so on, thought of themselves as white. When the census changed to say, no, there's a separate category, you can be Latino or Hispanic, many Latinos or Hispanics did not, check the box as being Latino or Hispanic, but rather white. Only over time did they then become to say, oh, I am Hispanic, I am Latino. Why? Well, because over time, the constitution of being a Latino, being a Hispanic, right, becomes integrated into society. It kind of actually affects the way in which we operate socially. We recognize others socially in certain cultures and things like that. Such that, what Foucault then is saying is, there is no such thing as, and this is perhaps beside the point, but there is no such thing as race, ethnicity, gender, he would say, prior to power. Power exercises, controls people. Rather, those concepts, those categories are the effects of power as certain kinds of social practices, certain kinds of social institutions, and economies of discourse and productions of knowledge and truth. Now, the point I want to focus on, though, is we can see in the case of the triangle, traditional model of power, the sovereign at the top-down exercise of power on subjects. Foucault is saying that's not the correct conception of power. Another model is the kind of concentric kind of power emanating from within a focal point, an origination. That also is not the correct way to think of power. Rather, his analytics of power thinks of it as a field, something like we could think of it as a grid, such that the lines kind of are practices or institutions, and the points where they meet, right, are the certain effects of power and what it makes possible. Now, this grid is not a perfect representation of the model of power Foucault is articulating, because you wouldn't have equal lines like that making equal sets of points. You would have a multiplicity, variety, plurality of different kinds of lines. There would be some places of contact that have more places. There would be some places that have more lines overlapping it than others, right? And that could make sense of the different kinds of abilities that are conferred to certain kinds of roles and practices and institutions. But that grid is more the model of power that Foucault is trying to articulate. Okay, the fourth methodological point. Power should not be analyzed deductively, but ascendingly. We analyze it from, in a sense, the bottom up. So he says, that is to say, it seems to me, and this would then be the fourth methodological precaution, that the important thing is not to attempt some kind of deduction of power, starting from its center and aimed at the discovery of the extent to which it permeates into the base, or of the degree to which it reproduces itself, down to and including the most molecular elements of society. One must rather conduct an ascending analysis of power, starting, that is, from its infinitesimal mechanisms, which each have their own history, their own trajectory, their own techniques and tactics, and then see how these mechanisms of power have been, and continue to be, invested, colonized, utilized, involuted, transformed, displaced, extended, etc., by ever more general mechanisms and by forms of global domination. And Foucault, he's done this because he really does kind of like historical sociological analyses in his books, that on madness, that on his book, The Birth of the Clinic and the Rise of Medicine and the Discipline of Medicine, the history of sexuality. So I've got a picture of kind of a mental institution, a case of early surgery, and then I've got Victorian clothing and kind of Victorian customs, which is in his book, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, where he talks about kind of the rise of this Victorian culture of sexuality and the kind of way in which sexuality was repressed through certain kind of cultural practices and certain discourses, and yet at the same time, sexuality was discussed more than ever insofar as it had there was a whole production of knowledge of sexuality. So just a sample of this. He says, to put this somewhat differently, the bourgeoisie, so this is kind of an example, the bourgeoisie has never had any use for the insane, right? So it's not that, the insane play like some fundamental role in the production of capitalism or society, but rather we can just see in the institution of the insane asylums and so on, and the relation of society to the insane, we can see at its extremities the kinds of effects of power. So they've never had any use for the insane, but the procedures it has employed to exclude them from society have revealed and realized from the 19th century onwards, and again on the basis of certain transformations, a political advantage, on occasion, even a certain economic utility, which have consolidated the system and contributed to its overall functioning. The bourgeoisie is interested in power, not in madness, in the system of control of infantile sexuality, not in that phenomenon itself. Right? It's about what makes these disciplines, what do they make possible? It's very, in that sense, kind of an instrumental analysis Foucault is articulating. The bourgeoisie could not care less about delinquents, about their punishment and rehabilitation, which economically have little importance, but it is concerned about the complex of mechanisms with which delinquency is controlled, pursued, punished, and reformed, etc. We'll see some of this in a moment more. But the fifth methodological point, power does not then produce ideological constructs. We shouldn't think of the production of truth and of knowledge as a kind of ideology that is false, but rather, right, it makes possible our institutions, it makes possible society, it makes possible our practices. And these are not things, then, the power is not something static that exists in the same form, but it evolves through the exercise of subtle mechanisms. He says, by way then of summarizing these 5 methodological precautions, I would say that we should direct our researches on the nature of power not towards the juridical edifice of sovereignty, the state apparatuses, and the ideologies which accompany them. So we don't want to look at power kind of as like, well, we really want to know about, focusing on the state and the power of the president or the sovereign, and that's where the questions of, justice and right, are focused. But rather, we want to focus, Foucault says, towards domination and the material operators of power, towards forms of subjection and the inflections and utilizations of their localized systems, and towards strategic apparatuses. We must eschew the model of Leviathan in the study of power. We must escape from the limited field of juridical sovereignty and state institutions, and instead base our analysis of power on the study of the techniques and tactics of domination. In speaking of the evolution of power, Foucault says there's a new type of power, which is why the more traditional model seen in the medieval era, which Leviathan then kind of responds out of, doesn't make sense anymore. The new type of power is disciplinary. What we see now in power involves discipline, surveillance, and normalization. He says, disciplines are the bearers of discourse, but this cannot be the discourse of right. The discourse of discipline has nothing in common with that of law, rule, or sovereign will. The disciplines may well be carriers of a discourse that speaks of a rule, but this is not the juridical rule deriving from sovereignty, but a natural rule, a norm. The code they come to define is not that of law, but that of normalization. And here's an example of where we can see what Foucault is talking about with this new type of power, disciplinary power. There's a famous experiment that was done by the psychologist Stanley Milgram, where he basically had a subject come in, and they were meant to administer shocks to somebody else in another room if they got an answer to a question wrong. Now, what happens is, originally the shocks are small. The person in the other room doesn't even make any noise. But then, as the questions go, the shocks get more and more intense. Now then, the subject asks a question. The fake test subject in the other room gets the question wrong. The subject administers a greater shock. And then the person in the other room starts to, ow! Well, then they keep going with the questions. The person in the other room gets it wrong. The shocks have to be raised more and more intense, according to the experimenter who's telling them, okay, you have to up the shocks according to this regiment. Now, they're not forcing. They're not saying, no, I will kill you, if you don't continue to shock the person in the other room. But at a certain point, as the shocks seem to get more and more intense, you start hearing screaming until eventually the person in the other room starts yelling, stop, stop. I've got a bad heart. I don't feel right. I need help. What happened? And this is a real experiment. What happened? A lot of the time, you had the subjects that continued to administer the shocks, even when they would say, I don't know, I think we need to stop. And yet the experimenter would say, no, we have to keep going. That's it, we have to keep going. You have to keep doing this. So the subject would continue. And then we continue administering the shocks until there was not even any noise in the other room anymore. Maybe the person's dead. What makes possible? Why would so many people in this study continue to administer those shocks, even when the person in the other room is saying stop? That subject is not being forced to do so, even when the subject wants to stop, and they say, I want to leave. And the experimenter says, no, you can't leave, you have to keep going. You agreed to do this. Well, Foucault's analysis of power shows us it's a certain kind of docility of authority. The experimenter is seen as an authority over which then the subject listens. They listen to what the experimenter has to say. They continue doing so not because they think the experimenter knows everything, not because they're being forced to by the threat of violence or anything like that, right? Which the traditional models of power would say. No. It's because of a certain internalization, of a certain relation the subject then has to other certain authority figures that makes them receptive to then the commands of people that are seen in positions of authority, such that they would even then continue doing things which they think are wrong. Another example of this would be in Foucault's book Discipline and Punish, where he opens up giving a graphic description of what he called the spectacle of the scaffold. So it used to be, let's say the 16th century. When somebody commits a crime and they need to be punished, they're punished in front of everybody as a demonstration of the power of the sovereign. And the punishment is a form of, torture. And yet, fast forward 100, 150 years later, by the end of the 18th century, and especially in the beginning of the 19th century, there's no more spectacle of the scaffold. When people have broken the law, They're punished behind closed doors. The public no longer sees the punishment. And it's not really a form of punishment anymore. It's a form of discipline. And he lists the way in which there's a kind of regimen. The prisoner wakes up at 6 a.m. At 6:10, the prisoner reports to the bathroom to wash up for the day. At 6:20, the prisoner reports to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. At 6:50, the prisoner reports to the work yard to perform labor. Whatever, right? Why did this transformation of punishment, from punishment to discipline in the prison, occur? Was it for humane reasons? That the spectacle of the scaffold then was seen as immoral? And Foucault tries to say no. Look at it in terms of the analytics of power. What does discipline enable? It enables a greater domination of bodies, a greater domination of subjects. It enables people to obey the law without any threat of violence, without being told constantly to do so, without physical force. And the greatest example of this we can see maybe is in the panopticon, which was developed by Jeremy Bentham. This idea in which you have a prison where you have a tower in the middle, and all the cells can be seen from the position of the guard tower. But you can't see into the guard tower, so you never know if anybody is actually there. And it's this way in which there's not even necessarily somebody's always watching you, but it's just somebody could be watching you. And what does that do? It inculcates a certain kind of normalization of conduct, of patterns of behavior. And look at our society now. All the ways in which then, through all kinds of surveillance, and not just through phones and cameras, that reinforce a certain conduct, a certain kind of pattern of behavior among people. But the way in which, think of a school setting, the way in which peers, does this student need to be reported? Are they acting weird? Are they acting different? Could they be a threat? Think of the way in which the teacher, right, surveils the students. Are they following the code of conduct, right? Constantly, you might be seen being on your phone and told there's a no phone policy. The way in which there's more windows now into rooms and things like that, where somebody could always be walking by. And who cares if somebody's going to see you in the classroom, right? But it's the sense in which you're always kind of potentially being observed in some way. And we can see this in the way that schools are actually oftentimes designed in ways that prisons are designed. They have similar architectural structures. Foucault is saying this, just looking at the development of architecture, shows us developments in power, and specifically disciplinary power, where power is diffused throughout society. It's not located in one ultimate, individual, the sovereign. Okay, so there are two conclusions then we can see from Foucault's model of analytics of power. First, contra Louis Althusser, which is interesting because Foucault actually studied under Louis Althusser. Foucault was trying to argue the base is not ultimately determinative. What matters most is not ideological power, because there's, ideology is the wrong way to think about it. Ideology says there's true consciousness and false consciousness, and ideology is false consciousness. And Foucault says, no, there is just knowledge produced by power, these power knowledge apparatuses. There is no true knowledge independent of power, because power is what makes possible concepts. Power is what makes possible institutions and practices and disciplines. This means the superstructure is at least, if not more, as determinative as the base. The focus of the real kind of movement of society then shouldn't be the economic base. It shouldn't be the state, but rather the institutions and practices in society, kind of that are, I should say maybe the multiplicity of institutions and practices in society. Secondly, what is then to be done? Because Foucault certainly is concerned with the rise of disciplinary power, even though, he claims his methodology is not value-laden. He still clearly thinks there's we should be concerned with the rise of disciplinary power. And he thinks what that means is we should not look to a new form of right that is tied to the principle of sovereignty, because coming up with new theories of right, he thinks, to try to mitigate the forms of disciplinary power misunderstands how power works. It's mistaken. Instead, we need to turn towards the possibility of right that is anti-disciplinarian and anti-normal. A new kind of right that says, I have, in a sense, the right to be weird. I have, in a sense, the right to not follow normal patterns of conduct. In a way, Foucault is advocating a kind of anarchist politics. So these are the two conclusions of his model of an analytics of power.